also see the other conversations we've hosted in this series. We have 3 more after today, and the full schedule is posted on the Wintergrand website and the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine's website. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you all again so much for joining us from wherever you are. We ourselves today are spread out over 5 time zones. So quite global today, which is appropriate given the theme of today's conversation. I'm Bill Maurer. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this event and the UC Irvine campus and its servers are within the ancestral and unceded shared territories of the Achemin and Tongva peoples. The region extends from the Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. As members of a land grant institution, we acknowledge the Achemin and Tongva as the traditional land caretakers whose efforts to steward and protect the land continue today. And I will hand it off now to Taylor Nelms.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Taylor Nelms. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute. And today we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Alberto Corsín Jiménez. Alberto is a reader in the Department of Social Anthropology at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid. So we're not only spread out across time zone, I think we have 3 continents represented on the panel today. Alberto received his PhD in social anthropology from Oxford, doing fieldwork in the Atacama Desert in Chile. Since then, Alberto has written widely on a truly diverse range of topics, and I was trying to think about how best to talk about Alberto's kind of research biography, and I think maybe just the long list of things that Alberto has written about might be useful. So Alberto's really, in my mind, your work has often reflected on and expanded on anthropological concepts in a really reflexive way. Everything from space to infrastructure to prototypes to trust to well-being to organization to the very notions of the relation or the concept themselves. Alberto is the author of, among many other publications, the book An Anthropological Trompe-l'œil for a Common World. Later on in this conversation, we will be joined by 3 PhD students, Kim Fernandez from the University of Pennsylvania, Nina Medvedeva from the University of Minnesota, and Nima Yolmo from the University of California, Irvine. Once again, we want to thank the Wintergrand Foundation and the University of California, Irvine School of Social Sciences, and to remind everyone on the line here that we will have time for your questions. So please do use the Q&A feature to submit those questions, and we'll circle back to them towards the middle and end of the conversation. So Alberto, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Taylor and Bill. Thanks to Nina and Kim for joining us and accompanying the conversation, and to Jenny Fan, who's been sort of behind the backstage with all the background preparations. My pleasure.
Great, thanks. Just one more quick reminder, this event is being live captioned by Lori Yeager Stavropoulos. So Lori, thank you so much. And just click the live transcription button at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to access those captions. And we will also be working to translate the transcript of this particular conversation into Spanish after the completion of the webinar. So Alberto, let's kick things off. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you do and how you ended up doing the work you're doing. Give us a little bit of that intellectual and professional biography, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think I'm the first non-US based scholar in the series. So I think it would be good to introduce to start by saying that the liberal public sphere in which that shapes academia and shapes anthropology, in particular in Spain, is very different from the US, or indeed from the UK, which is sort of provided my background. And I think sort of when I started thinking about this conversation, I thought that if I could give a sense of what the the structure of that liberal public sphere is. If at the end of the seminar, people could walk away with a sense of how anthropology is positioned institutionally as professional practitioners, but also as an intellectual field, how it is positioned within that space vis-a-vis people's ideas of how that space might be in the US mostly, or in Anglo-Saxon academy more largely. I would be happy with that. So so very quickly, I would say that I was trained as an anthropologist in the UK. I left Spain when I was very young, when I was about 20, for university in the UK. I trained first as an economist, and I worked as a futures and options broker in London, but very quickly sort of converted into anthropology, and I trained as an anthropologist in the UK, and I got my first appointments in the UK, and altogether spent about 20 years there, and finally moved back to Spain in 2009. So my upbringing as an academic and as an anthropologist in particular was within the context of UK academia, and upon arriving in Spain, really, kind of I had a dual identity, almost kind of a double citizenship. I was an 18-year-old, so my notion of myself as a Spaniard was the person who had left at the age of 18, and I spoke in Spanish like an 18-year-old. So I didn't I didn't have the baggage or the equipment, the academic equipment that was expected from a Spanish academic. But I did have that equipment as a sort of Anglo-Saxon trained anthropologist. So upon arriving in Spain, I was lucky enough to be funded in 2009 when I landed. I was very lucky to be almost immediately funded to carry out an ethnography, which I imagined at the time as a kind of relatively straightforward ethnography, kind of organizational or STS inflected ethnography of a media lab, a digital arts and sort of digital cultural center, which is a public media lab, public because it's publicly funded. It's owned and managed by Madrid's municipality. So I very early on in that research project, I was joined by another anthropologist here in Spain called Adolfo Estalella, and all our work since has been collaborative, and we've done work together. So pretty much everything that I'll be talking about today, I've thought about it and in the companionship with Adolfo. So I was joined by Adolfo. We got started, and to our surprise, we very quickly realized that media lab, sort of that publicly funded digital arts center, was populated by kind of a very interesting community, a number of very interesting communities. On the one hand, you had your digital artists and data scientists and hackers, but also there were a number of people who labeled themselves as free culture activists. For those of you who are not acquainted with the free culture movement began in the late 1990s. It was a digitally born movement that aimed for the free circulation of cultural works in the digital age on the internet. So basically against the encroachment of intellectual property law and copyright, etc., on the circulation of digital content. So these are the people that in the late 1990s, people like Richard Stallman, who invented the copyleft license, very famous hacker, who invented the copyleft licenses, or Lawrence Lessig, the Harvard intellectual property law professor, who, amongst others, invented or developed the Creative Commons licenses, or even indeed the whole Wikipedia movement. So those are kind of emblematic exemplars of the free culture movement, are Wikipedia, Creative Commons, copyleft, etc. But funnily, in this Spanish context, the free culture activists that we met in 2009, there were some hackers and there were some intellectual property lawyers who are the emblematic figures of the movement. But most of them were actually sort of what we, in the Southern European context, or in the European context, are known as autonomous activists. So these are kind of people who've been struggling for the right to the city, for the urban commons, for against youth, in the Spanish context, against youth precarity. So we have a huge youth unemployment in Spain, with over almost 40% of under 30s unemployed. So you had urban commoners, actually, crucially, which I forgot, squatters, so squatted social centers. So you had right to the city neighborhood, right to the city activists, neighborhood associations as squatters, who were in the late 1990s the recipients or the vehicles through which the free culture movement landed in Spain. So not your usual suspects. No hacker, I mean, you had hackers, but hackers who developed their work as free culture activists within the context of, you know, those urban autonomous groups. And then you had also architects, community, guerrilla community architects, and you had community artists. So certainly in 2009, you know, what we thought was going to be, you know, the way we had imagined an ethnography of a media lab populated by digital artists, maybe some hackers, maybe some data scientists, it turned out to be not an ethnography of a digital culture or new forms of digital practice, but it turned out to be an ethnography of an urban ethnography, really. And in that context, we realized that there were kind of three public spheres or three spheres of interlocution. So we had the public sphere, because this was a public institution, so a publicly funded, you know, welfare state institution, your classic idea of welfarism, in this case, the municipality funding. So the Media Lab as an icon or as a beacon of the delivery of public goods or public service. Then you had the people, the commons activists, so for whom their interlocution with the public institution was interesting. You know, but they were trying to kind of re-articulate it or redirect it in favor of the commons. So, you know, they kind of refashioned the idea of the public in the language and in the theoretical vocabulary of the commons. And then you had the free culture activists, who again had a completely different idea of what the public, you know, what was at stake in the transformation of the public sphere, because for them, it was working on and it entailed particular infrastructural transformations. So of technological sovereignty. So, you know, the hackers wanted the internet to be free, but not free as in, you know, gratis, but free as in freedom. And they wanted the, as Richard Stallman famously put it, they wanted the infrastructures of the internet. They wanted the archives and the repositories and the underlying technologies. They wanted them to be free. So their conception of the public sphere was really, in their imaginary is a free sphere or a Libre sphere. So this kind of is what we came across was a very interesting scenario where the public, the commons, and the Libre were traversed by a kind of similar population of activists, but whose allegiances and genealogies were different. So the commoners, activists, they claimed allegiance or genealogy to the autonomous tradition, anarchist traditions, especially Spanish, are what we in Spain call Republican, which is the exact antithesis of American Republicans. So, so basically anarchist traditions, free culture activists who claimed allegiance or who traced their genealogies to new modalities of, partly Californian ideologies, ideas of utopianism, but also anarcho-libertarianism, but also in the Spanish context, libertarian infrastructural socialism. And then you had your classic public institution, which laid allegiance to the welfare state and the second half sort of, late 20th century ideas of liberal social democracy, etc. So that's the context where I parachuted in 2009 as an UK trained social anthropologist. So that kind of my background.
So I wonder, Alberto, if we might ask you then to reflect a little bit on, since then, how do you think your anthropology or your social science has been shaped by or changed in response to your engagements with this really, diverse set of social movements and, intellectual and political traditions?
So I would say completely. So I don't recognize, so I look back and the person I was in say, this is a bit of a caricature, it's an exaggeration, but the academic I was pre-2009 is a completely different persona to the academic I am today. And I would say, so for instance, when I landed in Spain in this climate, in this scenario, some of the people, some of my interlocutors, they were incredibly articulate. So you had intellectual property lawyers, you had hackers, community architects and community artists who had been experimenting with their own forms of communication and sometimes publishing. So fanzines, pamphlets, manifestos, museum exhibition catalogs, sometimes academic books, and taking those genres and forms and venues to the limit. So in the case of hackers, for instance, often experimenting with forms of trying to cancel the idea of the author and experimenting with multiple identity authorship or with anonymous identities, and blending those, blending those conceptions of the author in the material form itself of the communication outlet. So, so for instance, the early blogs and early sort of podcasts or free radio programs, which often took place in particular kinds of neighborhoods, marginal neighborhoods, and there were ways to empower local communities, and therefore to experiment with who was the person, the agent that was claiming enunciation in those spaces. Was it the neighborhood? Was it the squatter social center? Was it the guerrilla architectural collective? Was it a group of anonymous hackers that were violating copyright? And therefore they, it was paramount that they completely left no traces of their own sort of personal identity. So, so I came across these people who had been experimenting in forms of publishing, in forms of communication, have been building their own archives and repositories and infrastructures for doing these things. So famously in the case of hackers, you might, everyone has heard of indie media, When in 1998-99 with the Seattle global protests and the sudden appearance of the global independent media centers. Well, in the Spanish case, Spain was one of the earliest subscribers to the indie media format. So hacker activists building the infrastructures, enabling new forms of communication. So it was completely, for me, it was the discovery of a new public sphere, or the discovery that the public sphere was shaped and materialized and staged in completely different ways, that it required infrastructures and material supports and effective communities, which were completely different from those of the academy as I had known it.
And then I wonder if you could just say a word about, you said there was sort of this before and after moment, and you weren't the same person before as you became. Could you talk about that also, not just in relation to the diversity of publics that you then encountered and engaged with and were in conversation with, but also about your work itself and how you imagined your work, but also like what this anthropology thing is?
Yeah, so for instance, in the Spanish context, one of the things we picked up, Adolfo and I picked up, was that this is a very eclectic community of people. So you have hackers and artists and community architects and autonomous activists for the right to the city, or fighting against precarity of youth unemployment or illegal immigration, in favor of illegal immigrants. So really eclectic community. But they all seemed to converge on a notion of their work as, and this is the word they would often use, as a prototype. So for them, the idea of the prototype was a figure of speech, was a concept figure that allowed them to speak because of the connotations of the word. It allowed them to speak of particular kinds of socio-technical designs or socio-technical infrastructures. So prototypes as things, as say a website or an archive or an infrastructure. But it also gestured, the idea of the prototype gestured to a socio-technical design that is not closed, is open, is in a prototype state, and it's enabled to remain open by particular kinds of tools like free intellectual property licenses or free patents, right? So which means that anyone can pick up the prototype and work on it and modify it and edit it and take it home, so long as whatever they do to it, they respect the conditions upon which they received it, right? So you can take a prototype and improve it or modify it or do whatever you want to do with it, but you cannot copyright it, right? Because that would violate the terms under which you got it. So prototypes were socio-technical designs with particular kinds of legal licenses attached to them, particular kinds of infrastructures of collaboration. So a prototype in the vision or in the imagination of the people I worked with could work as a prototype because it was open for other people to come in and and edit it and modify it. So it was designed in such a way that it carried an infrastructure of collaboration, so to speak. So for instance, this design, if we're talking about, say that we're talking about the design for community architects that are working with the marginal neighborhood community and trying to build a playground for the children in that marginal neighborhood. And the designs for that playground, they put up the designs on the internet so that anyone can, can look at them and download them and improve them, etc. Now, the standard software that architects use for architectural drawing and designing, it's proprietary. So you need to buy a license to work with the software, and therefore if you download the designs for the internet, it's no good because you don't have the license that will enable you to run the software, to tinker with the designs. So community architects have, in realizing that, eventually what they did is to develop their own software. So they had to become software hackers in order to do their architectural work, right? So that's what building infrastructures of collaboration means. We need to build the software that allows others to work with us in order to do our work together, in order to do our work as architects. So the prototype entails or embodies all these little things, a particular attitude or sensibility or orientation to the law, to legal licenses, a particular attitude, orientation, or sensibility to the infrastructures of collaboration, to putting up documentation on the web for others to learn, etc. So go back to your question, Bill. Now, in working with these communities, with these people, it became eventually it became obvious to us that it would be almost impossible for us to study free culture prototyping without becoming ourselves, without turning our own ethnography into a prototype for free culture. So what would ethnography and ethnography as a free culture object look like, right? What kind of legal transformations we would have to inject to the discipline? What kind of infrastructures of collaboration we would have to design? What kind of pedagogical vectors we would have to, so kind of thinking through the transformation of ethnography as a prototype, inspired by our free culture interlocutors, challenged us to rethink ethnography through those kind of three vectors: the legal challenges, legal licenses, the design of infrastructures of collaboration, and the design of new forms of pedagogical sort of companionship or accompaniment. And we did it through a number of ways. So, for instance, maybe the one project we're most proud of is a project called Ciudad Escuela, the city as school, which is a digital archive, a digital infrastructure that we built with community activists, with architects, well, basically with all the groups of people that I mentioned before. And it's kind of a repository of urban apprenticeships, how different communities in different cities, in this case in Spain, although the project has been replicated in some Latin American countries, how different urban communities make explicit different trajectories of apprenticeship, things that are learning that have been proved useful. Could be anything from running a community assembling using WhatsApp or Slack or this or that digital tool, or building community-based cartographic tools. So this repository that we built, Ciudad Escuela, is an archive of all those grassroots, bottom-up systems of apprenticeship, of learning, pedagogical tools, etc.
So the idea here, right, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that in some ways, many of the kind of central principles and techniques associated with this really diverse group of free culture activists and organizers and architects and et cetera, teachers, so on, those became models, maybe even prototypes themselves for your vision of what anthropology or ethnography could do. So I guess my question is then, how did these folks, right, imagine the anthropologist in their midst, right? So like, what in their imagination could anthropology or ethnography do for them, if anything?
Well, that's a very good question, and we're still trying to figure it out. So I think it took them a long time, a very long time, to appreciate the distinctiveness of ethnography as a sensibility. But I think, maybe I'm talking like 6 or 7 years, right? But of late, over the last 3 or 4 years, I think our skill as ethnographers, so the specificity of, our participating in this ongoing experiments for almost 10 years now, the specificity of ethnography as a mode of description, as a mode of attentiveness, as a mode of making connections between places, things, people, sometimes comparative connections, sometimes analytical connections. That I would say that takes, at least in our case, it took a long time for our interlocutors to appreciate it. But now it's something they value, and they, and they value what we bring as writers. So our capacity, one of our most treasured skills is writing. So they value our writing skills, and and they often ask us to help writing proposals or writing manifestos or writing documents for which are going to be sent to the political authorities. So writing is a valued skill, but also the intensity of the gaze, the outlook. I think it's also valued.
Thanks. I think that this might lead right into one of our next questions, but it looks like Taylor's going to ask it. So.
Oh no, go ahead, Bill. I mean, so the question I kind of had, and then I'll let you kind of follow up, because I'm interested to hear what you have to say too, is, one of the ways, or one of the channels maybe, in which anthropology or ethnography might be repurposed in this kind of prototype way, right, is in publishing, right? That's one of the key sites of contestation, maybe, right, for free culture activists and for anthropology as in its encounter with free culture activists and social movements. So I wonder if maybe we could ask you a little bit to to reflect a little bit on, your work on academic publishing, in a particular project maybe that you're involved in to kind of remake publishing in its encounter, in the kind of intersection between academia and free culture. Was that what you were going to ask, Bill?
So, I mean, yes. I mean, it kind of, I've always been very interested in the digital as a medium of expression and as a tool that, is transforming the 21st century public sphere. So when I was back in the UK, I was involved. I think I was amongst the very first bloggers in a kind of failed experiment that the Association of Social Anthropologists had called the Global Lock. Horrible name, no wonder that it failed. It was like 2005 or 2006. So, the medium of the digital was always, it was as a user, as maybe an advanced user or as a young user, I was very much into it. But my experience of its importance to the discipline and to the structural transformation of anthropology was foreign to me until I started working with free culture activists, and because that's the hallmark of what they do, is that the structural transformation of the public sphere will only happen if we take seriously, if we take command and control of its the tools through which it's legalized, the tools through which it's infrastructuralized, and the tools through which it's, and the storytelling tools through which is documented and pedagogized, so to speak. So that came as a shock to me. And when I sort of, when I came back home every day, from working with free culture activists, and suddenly sort of in taking refuge in my, sense of self as an anthropologist, I was ashamed. I was like, our discipline it's what we've done to our discipline over the last 20, this was 10 years ago, to 2009, 2010. What the state of the discipline then, it was horrific. We all our main scholarly journals, we had over the past 30 years, we had transferred sometimes ownership, sometimes just the means of publishing to the big commercial publishing houses, to the Wileys and Sage and Elsevier's. And not only that, but also our archives. So we were letting go of the process of digitalization of our archives, and letting some of these giant publishers to take control of that, and in so doing, really defining what our future scholarly public sphere is going to look like. So whenever we Google for an article, we have lost entirely control of how the list of results, which articles appear at the top, which articles appear at the bottom. So our own interests and intellectual agendas, and are being completely shaped by other people, and it just and eventually, of course, it's just an issue of not holding up to the challenges that my interlocutors were putting to us. Basic questions that we all face as anthropologists: where are you going to publish this stuff? How are we going to read it? And saying, well, you won't be able to read it unless you pay $40 and download. So basically, it was at that time that I decided to become more active, or try to become more active in pushing, or trying to push our discipline into open access activism, mostly by way of our learned societies, because at the end of the day, some of the, not all, but some of the most important journals in the discipline are owned by learned societies. So the AAA owns 22 journals. The Royal Anthropological Institute owns 3 or 4 journals. So it's crucial for to try to lobby and start to create lobbying groups, or an intellectual climate, and that's, well, I joined the company of other people who had been doing it for a long time, and just trying to reach out and lend a hand. And that's when, about 2012 or 13, we decided to launch Libraria, or Libreria, different people pronounce it different ways, which was just basically a group of 4 or 5 people who had, over the years, become committed to opening access to anthropological materials, and just becoming a nuisance at AAA meetings, at the AAA executive and the IASA executive and the Royal Anthropological Institute. And that's it. I mean, to be honest, I think we've been, we're not to be commended by anything, just by, the fact we've been a nuisance for a long time, and just the climate of opinion has changed, not because of us, but because of many other transformations. But yeah.
I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the librarians of the world, incidentally, just because, at least in my institutional location in UC Irvine and the University of California system, it's been our librarians who have really been at the forefront of pushing for open access and open publishing, and have been taking the battle to the Elsevier's of the world. So, and it certainly kind of changed the way that many of our research faculty think about publishing. Like they might actually stop, you know, especially I think on the STEM side of campus, they might actually stop and think, huh, maybe not this journal, maybe this other journal instead. But Taylor, are we gonna hand it over to Nina, Nima, and Kim now, I think, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hand it over to our trio of PhD students to ask their questions and engage in the conversation.
Sure thing. So I'll go first. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. It's really nice to hear that there is, you know, like common social culture still alive and well in Spain after seeing the same sort of cultures, particularly in DC and New York City, just gentrified out. Like a lot of our shared collective spaces are not Starbucks. So maybe the same thing's happening in Spain, but it's nice to hear that there's still spaces that are alive and well. I actually wanted to ask a question about sort of like with any commons project, you have to deal with the threat of enclosure and capture. And specifically here, I'm thinking about GitHub as a form of open source software, which at this point, a lot of corporations have forked and created their own versions of it. Like if you look at Airbnb's initial public offering filings, they actually say that one of the greatest risks that they have as a corporation is the fact that they're dependent on this like one very specific GitHub open source thing. So I was kind of wondering how projects like yours, but also the community that you're a part in, negotiate these questions of enclosure and capture.
Thank you, Nina, for your question. Well, I think that's where the singular, you know, the specificity of the Spanish case comes to you know, it matters. I mean, I'll tell you a story which is kind of famous in the hacker circles. So back in 2002, when Wikipedia was scarcely 1 or 2 years old, Jimmy Wales decided that they were not cashing in any money. So it was about time to start putting some advertisements and trying to cash in on the contributions by the Wikipedians, by the editors. And a group of actually 4 Spanish Wikipedians, they decided that was completely unsolicited and it was against the spirit of the Wikipedia project. So they decided to back then, I think it's Spanish and German were after English were the 2 most important languages in Wikipedia. So they downloaded, because Wikipedia back then had a specific kind of free software license that downloaded all the content and took it to a server at the University of Seville and put it up and launched what they called a new online encyclopedia, which was called the Enciclopedia Libre Universal, the Libre Universal Encyclopedia. Now that was a huge challenge to Wikipedia, and you can find, you know, if you're interested in the details, the Wired magazine ran a story about the revolt of the Spanish Wikipedians like 10 years ago or something like that. But it was a huge challenge, and eventually James Wales conceded to the claims from the Spanish Wikipedians, which were, okay, Wikipedia will be free from ads from now on, and we will set up a foundation that will run the host and run the entire Wikipedia. Anyway, for me, the interesting bit about all this story is that when they took all the content, they took it to a public university, the University of Seville, which gave away the infrastructure for free. Right? So in Spain, the articulation or the relationship between the public and the commons and the libre, you know, that triangulation that I described at the very beginning, is very specific. And I think commons projects have learned very quickly that they cannot scale up without the help or the adjacency or accompaniment of the public, of the state. So I think that if there is a bit, I mean, this is a huge generalization, but I think an interesting difference between the way in which free culture and commons project have tend to play out or pan out in the US and the way they pan out in Spain, but also in Italy and a little bit in Portugal and Greece, is not by kind of benchmarking themselves against the private sector and the objectives of the private sector, but by seeking the help or seeking support from the public sector. So that's kind of a quick answer to your question.
Thank you, Alberto. I'm going second. And my question kind of ties up to what you just said. And it relates to this earlier question that you had set up about what would ethnography as a free culture would look like, right? And you touched upon this question of infrastructures of collaborations that need to be built, wherein instances of people learning skills that would then allow for collaborations. The question I had, or if you could elaborate a little more, was the sense of others that's implicated in this, right? Like also tied to a question of public, but this sense of other is like much different than what we would otherwise associate with. So it'd be, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question, Nima. This is a very fascinating question. And in this Spanish, I mean, I don't think I could, I would love to broach it in expansively, but I know we don't have time. But very quickly, I would just say that in the Spanish context, free culture activism is both an inchoation, or a kind of an inchoation of both positive and negative liberties. So the types of positive liberties or positive freedoms that it tries to inchoate are freedom for the free circulation of digital content on the internet, so free from the encroachment of intellectual property rights, freedom for controlling the infrastructures, so technological sovereignty, so not having the Facebooks and the Twitters and etc. So and those are the positive liberties, but there are also negative liberties. So it's not just freedom for, but also freedom from. And the free culture movement in Spain, when it started coming together in the late 1990s, it was coming together as a way of seeking liberation from a very oppressive culture, which was the culture of post-dictatorship. So Spain had been coming out, Spain had a 40-year dictatorship, which ended in 1975. For about 30 years, that the culture of transition, the transition from dictatorship to democracy, produced a culture which historians now refer as the culture of transition, which was a hegemonic bloc of liberal consensus and pro-European, modernizing utopias, right? And it was, so membership of the European Union, precarization, flexibilization, and all those things that came along. And in the late 1990s, youth, young activists had enough, and they were trying to find ways to break from that oppressive post-dictatorial culture. And free culture afforded that. So it was freedom from, it was many other things, but also freedom from that. And actually, when the Occupy movement happened around the world, but also in Spain, it was kind of the awakening that was what happening. And so historians now are looking back to our Occupy movement in 2011, not as, they are redescribing 2011's Occupy movement in Spain as the moment when we finally break loose from the culture of transition. Now, we were completely oppressed by 40 years of transitional culture. So our others, going back to your question, is a complex question, but our others are inflected or in complex way inflected by the ghosts of fascism, white nationalist Catholic culture, so Catholicism. So anyway, this is, great question, very difficult for me to put in 3 minutes, but kind of along those lines.
Thank you.
Alberto, I kind of wanted to follow up on this conversation about research and what's been made possible by revisiting some of what had come up when we were initially talking about today's conversation, which is the role of professional societies and how they shape the landscape of what is being researched. And I think particularly in the US, many anthropologists, even those who continue to work outside the university system, maintain relationships and identify as anthropologists through being able to participate in professional organizations. I know that some of this context and this landscape might be different in Spain and in Europe more broadly. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how professional societies have funded what and supported otherwise what is being researched and where research goes.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I think learned societies are kind of, I think it's a very good question, is it? Because you do point to an actor or a kind of type of agency that we rarely sort of reflect, which is at the core of how we organize ourselves as a discipline. And we almost, we rarely theorize it. So, we actually rarely sort of take consciousness of how much of our agency as institutional actors is channeled through, explicitly or implicitly, is delegated to learned societies. And I think learned societies are, if historians of the future in our discipline, my feeling is that they will look back at the role of learned societies from the mid-1990s to roughly today, and they don't, they cannot be cast in a nice light. They've been, I don't know, they've been responding to who, I wouldn't know what kind of interests, but definitely not the interests of the reproduction of the discipline. I don't think they've been enabling the mobilization of new energies, new commitments, new actors. In my case, what I know most as someone who's been from the side of open access activism, learned societies are largely to blame for not taking a leading role in that. And they come up with lots of excuses, and some of them are good arguments, but at the end of the day, some things are changing, but some learned societies are much worse off in terms of the role they play in shaping the the conversation and the intellectual conversation for the discipline. They are in a much worse position. They have much less control now than they had 35 years ago.
Thanks so much, Alberto. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and we have a really great one from Tim Elfenbein in the Q&A. And so I'll just read it aloud. It's really fascinating. So Tim writes, it's really interesting to hear of how your ethnographic engagement expanded beyond your initial field of interlocutors to your thoughts about and work on the social organization of anthropology as a discipline. And this seems largely enabled, he suggests, by a deep kind of overlapping of ethical and political visions, right? So the hypothetical is, right, if you had parachuted rather into the digital media lab in Spain, if you had parachuted into a VC-funded digital arts lab say in Silicon Valley, right, promoting entrepreneurship or whatever the opposite, right, of that kind of free culture movement might be. How might that have fundamentally shifted your kind of mode of anthropological engagement, right? So, Tim's question is really about like how your professional shift, your intellectual shift, the engagement that you've had with anthropology itself, its ideas and its infrastructures as a discipline, has been made possible by that overlap in ethical political vision.
Thanks, Tim, for that question. Well, I think it would be. I have no doubts it would have been very different. I mean, I think there are a number of biographical and historical and kind of broader sociological contexts that inflect our trajectories as individuals or as our personas as academics. So my upbringing in that sort of culture, oppressive, that was the culture of transition that I was talking about. And the particular sort of configuration of the Spanish public liberal sphere under the ghosts of Francoism and the ghost of post-dictatorial fascism. So that, I think that sort of has located me in a, as you very nicely put it, has inflected particular kinds of ethical political visions to my work and my commitments and my allegiances. But had I stayed in British academia, for instance, I think I would have found other outlets to give expression to those commitments and passions and energies. And had it been a Media Lab sort of focus on entrepreneurship, I cannot even imagine what other outlets, but I suppose there would have been other outlets for me to find, for channeling those energies.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question especially about as it relates to the stories we tell as anthropologists, right? About the ethnographic work that we do, right? To cede space to the interlocutors who, we say then reshape the kind of the work that we do and the stories that we tell. I'm reminded of Marilyn Strathern's old comment about what ethnography is, right? That it involves, by necessity, the giving of oneself over to the interests of one's interlocutors, right? And so to some degree that has to be made possible by a set of pre-existing commitments or allegiances, maybe even ones we didn't know we had or couldn't quite articulate as such, right, in advance of that encounter. So, we're coming up on time. Alberto, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts or comments, prompted by this exchange?
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and it's really built in some really profound ways, I think, on previous conversations. So let me just thank Alberto again for joining us. Thanks to Nima, Kim, and Nina again for your always incredibly important insights. And let me note that our next webinar will be actually next week, next Friday, February 12th, same time, slightly different channel. So look for a new Zoom link. But we'll be joined by another special guest, Angela Russell, who's the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CUNA Mutual Group, which is an insurance company. And I think that you will find that conversation to be incredibly exciting and insightful as well. Angela is not an anthropologist by training; she comes out of public health. But consider her to be an anthropologist in everything but name. So thank you again, Alberto, for joining us. Thank you for this really incredibly exciting conversation, and I hope that everyone will join us next time.
Thank you, Alberto.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Alberto.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.